Hello, I'm Matt G, and I study and design tabletop role playing and other story games. Today, I'd like to explore a new type of story for role playing games. That's new to role playing games, not to new new type of story altogether. In book form, they're called literature, and more specifically, they're subdivision of that called which I call domestic stories. Examples of domestic stories in books can be Dmitry Nasralla's Hotline, which was the Canada E Reads book for this year, and John Green's The Fault in Our Stars, which is follows a similar story as what I tried game I tried to create. Domestic stories are tend to be smaller stories with lower stakes than your regular adventure. They can, however, be more meaningful and nuanced, and they tend to have more ways to succeed, fail, or have things happen. And that's the big problem with using other systems already established for games like Dungeons and Dragons. Um, so it's this tends to focus on extremes. It's life or death, um, reward, punishment, and it's much easier to design systems that have to account for extreme outcomes than for systems that have to account for many different outcomes. Just look at how different games handle damage. Um, how do you apply penalties? Do you apply penalties? How much of a penalty? Do those penalties affect every action or not? Are there ways to ignore the damage penalties? Now, imagine having to do that for every single aspect of the world. Converting everything to numbers makes the game quickly become unwieldy. And so that's why most designers tend to use words instead of numbers, or at least try to use words as much as possible. I didn't understand that when I designed my first domestic RPG. It was called Terribly Beautiful, and it was created for a design contest. In it, you play a former prostitute who is dying of an STD called the Pale. It's called the Pale because it turns its victims pale and gaunt before killing them. The goal of the game is to achieve something meaningful before you die. So, this was follows the same thing story idea as The Fault in Our Stars, or similar story idea as The Fault in Our Stars, but I wasn't aware of the story for The Fault in Our Stars, and I think I made it around the time that The Fault in Our Stars was published. So, two people came up with independent ideas, but Terribly Beautiful used a tarot card system that described plot complications that I like to keep filed away in the back of my head. That mechanic worked on the scale of sessions or parts of sessions rather than individual actions. So it's effectively plot twists or problems. For individual actions, however, this is where I really fell down. Terribly Beautiful relied on a simple success failure mechanic driven with initiative systems, etc. And that was totally the wrong approach, but you live and you learn. And yes, I realized that the initials of Terribly Beautiful are TB, which John Green is fantastically promoting the fight against TB. And so, stands for tuberculosis, the disease that inspired both the goth fashion depicted in the artwork and the disease I created called the Pale. I decided to create the fictional version in order to merge it with AIDS and um, have elements of necrosis too. Of course, other people have designed domestic games too. Uh, Perfect example is Avery Alder's The Quiet Year, and even though it's not really a domestic-ish game, it could be a domestic game. So, and very fun little map making game. Avery Alder also designed games like Dream Askew and Ribbon Drive, which Dream Askew, a numberless, or sorry, a diceless system. Ribbon Drive, similar. Ribbon Drive actually has a great mechanic wherein you play until your mixtapes run out. And if you don't know what a mixtape is, ask an older person. So, I will let you know it's musical. Avery Alder also was the person who, as far as I can tell, was first to invent the terminology story games and to describe the sorts of games that they were designing at the Forge. The Forge was a very experimental design place, and it's that experimental culture informed both Avery's and my own design philosophies. Similarly, Golden Sky Stories, not designed at the Forge, but translated by someone who worked there, or at least who frequented there. And it is called Yuyaki Koyaki. I'm mispronouncing that. I know that. But in Japanese, anyways. English title Golden Sky Stories. You actually play as little animal gods, and you get powers and have to use them to investigate problems and make friends with the local village, and not really fight. So, yeah. So, I did design in the past another game called Rascals. It was never published, but it was much better working as a domestic RPG than anything or at least Terribly Beautiful was, because it worked a little differently from most RPGs. It had, or designated one of the players as a storyteller, and that player would keep telling the story until they either volunteered to give it up, or some people would interrupt them for challenges. And Rascals followed the stories of a bunch of homeless kids, which were also parentless in a rather uncaring world. So, and it was inspired by movies like Grave of the Fireflies and another Japanese movie which I don't remember. But yeah, I tested Rascals, and two types of players. In one test, two players who had played Dungeons and Dragons before and therefore had some knowledge of how to play role-playing games, and one player who had never role-played before and therefore had no idea what he was doing, but he was excited to try it. So, the two players, funny thing happened, two players who actually had played before, they actually had more trouble picking it up because Rascals has a very specific rhythm and cadence to it, and it was very different from Dungeons and Dragons, and so Dungeons and Dragons based on turn taking. Um, and I imagine they tried to parse it into Dungeons and Dragons. Meanwhile, the person who had never played before, he managed to learn a bit quicker and actually was able to play a fair bit longer or a fair bit better. So, um, yeah, so I don't like how generic Rascal system is. Despite its focus on meaning and nuance, the more generic the system, the more generic the story it's likely to create. I want to design a system that is focused and explores a particular type of meaning or whatever. And that is at the sacrifice of being adaptable. Not every system is, well, every system actually is geared towards certain types of stories. Um, and so even if you get a system like Universalis or GURPS or Hero system, which is the interlock system, or even the D20 system, they're geared towards certain types of stories and they're not they don't provide much support for other types of stories. So that's why I want to start exploring rules that explore the nuance and the meaning of things and have more than just success, failure, etc. Now, few of you may point to my game Metropolitan Luxury Coffin, which features people just trying to get by in a cyberpunk world, as a potentially domestic game. It's not. MLC is all about exaggeration and extremes for the sake of satire, and not the exploration of meanings and nuance. Uh, that's something I had to struggle with for a while. And yes, I could rebuild it as a domestic RPG, but that's at the sacrifice that of everything that made MLC. Uh, Gave it its flavor, gave it uh, uh, its comedy and everything else like that. So Uh, yeah, it's domestic RPGs are all about exploring meaning, nuance, and so that's what I'd like to do with a new system. So until next session, uh, have a great day.